October 17th, 1944. Imperial Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Soimu Toyoda studied the reconnaissance reports with undisguised satisfaction. American carrier task forces were approaching the Philippines precisely as anticipated. After months of retreating across the Pacific, after the devastating losses in the Marianas, the moment for Japan's decisive counterstroke had finally arrived. The trap was set. Operation Sho-Go would lure the American fleet to its destruction. "We have drawn them into our web exactly as planned," Toyoda told his staff. "The Americans believe their industrial superiority guarantees victory. They will learn that Japanese spirit and strategy can overcome any material disadvantage. Let them come with their hundreds of ships. We will destroy them in the waters of the Philippines." What Toyoda failed to grasp was that in Pearl Harbor, a team of American cryptographers had already decoded enough Japanese naval traffic to understand the basic outline of Sho-Go. Admiral Chester Nimitz and his intelligence officers knew a trap was being prepared. More critically, the American admirals approaching Leyte possessed not just numerical superiority, but a 3-year education in naval warfare that had transformed them from peacetime officers into the most experienced naval commanders in history. Within 4 days, Toyoda's intricate plan would result not in the destruction of the American invasion force, but in the virtual annihilation of the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective fighting force. The trap he had so carefully prepared would close instead on his own fleet. The proclamation that triggered Japanese confidence came on October 12, 1944, as American carrier planes struck Formosa. Admiral Toyoda, visiting the island at that precise moment, witnessed what his inexperienced pilots reported as a magnificent victory. Standing in the operations center, he received report after report of American carriers burning, battleships listing, cruisers fleeing. Japanese pilots claimed 11 carriers sunk, 2 battleships destroyed, multiple cruisers eliminated. The remnants of Halsey's Third Fleet, they insisted, were limping away in defeat. The truth was starkly different. The Americans had lost no ships, not a single carrier had been sunk. The inexperienced Japanese pilots, thrown into combat with minimal training, had mistaken their own losses for enemy casualties. Of 600 Japanese aircraft committed to the battle, 500 had been shot down. The Americans lost 89 planes. But Toyoda believed the false reports completely. This perceived victory shaped everything that followed. Convinced that Halsey's fleet was crippled, Toyoda activated Sho-Go with supreme confidence. The timing seemed perfect. The weakened Americans would be unable to resist the combined might of Japan's remaining fleet. The battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest warships ever built, would finally fulfill their destiny. Each displaced 72,000 tons fully loaded. Each mounted 9 18.1-inch guns capable of firing 3,200-pound shells over 26 miles. They were, Toyoda believed, invincible. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita would command the main striking force. A veteran of numerous Pacific battles, Kurita had seen Japan's steady retreat since Midway. Now, finally, he would lead the counterstrike that would reverse the war's momentum. His center force contained the super battleships Yamato and Musashi, 3 older battleships, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. This fleet would traverse the Sibuyan Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait, and descend upon MacArthur's invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf from the north. The plan's audacity lay in its complexity. While Kurita attacked from the north, 2 additional forces would strike from the south through Surigao Strait. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura commanded battleships Yamashiro and Fuso with supporting vessels. Behind him, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima led another independent force. Meanwhile, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa would sail from Japan with 4 aircraft carriers to act as bait, drawing Halsey's carriers northward, away from Leyte. It was a gambit requiring perfect timing, precise coordination, and above all, American cooperation in following the script Toyoda had written. The Japanese admiral was betting everything on his ability to predict his enemy's actions. The transformation of the United States Navy since Pearl Harbor had been as profound as any military evolution in history. In December 1941, the Pacific Fleet possessed 8 battleships, 3 aircraft carriers, and limited experience in carrier warfare. By October 1944, Task Force 38 alone contained 16 aircraft carriers with over 1,000 aircraft, while the 7th Fleet supporting MacArthur's invasion included 18 escort carriers with another 500 planes. But numbers told only part of the story. American naval aviators now averaged 300 hours of flight training before entering combat. Japanese pilots, desperately rushed through abbreviated programs, received less than 100 hours. American radar-directed fighter control could vector interceptors precisely onto incoming raids. Japanese ships still relied primarily on visual spotting. American damage control teams had perfected techniques that could save seemingly doomed vessels. Japanese damage control remained primitive by comparison. Admiral William Halsey commanded the Third Fleet with aggressive confidence born from 3 years of victory. His Task Force 38, under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, represented the most powerful naval striking force ever assembled. Each of its 4 task groups contained more firepower than entire pre-war navies. Pilots who had been ensigns at Coral Sea were now veteran squadron commanders who had survived dozens of combats. Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid's 7th Fleet, supporting MacArthur's invasion directly, included a phenomenon that hadn't existed 3 years earlier: massive amphibious warfare capability. Over 700 vessels had assembled for the Leyte invasion, from attack transports to tank landing ships to rocket-firing gunboats. The amphibious commanders had learned their trade through blood and error at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan. They now executed complex operations with clockwork precision. October 20th marked MacArthur's promised return. At 10 a.m., American soldiers began landing on Leyte's eastern shore. By afternoon, MacArthur himself waded through the surf, photographers capturing his dramatic return to the Philippines after 2.5 years of exile. Within hours, 132,000 American troops were ashore with massive quantities of supplies and equipment. The efficient reality of American amphibious warfare had made Toyoda's plan obsolete before his fleet even sailed. Kurita's center force departed Brunei on October 22nd, sailing northeast toward their destiny. Toyoda's final message rang with historical certainty. The fate of the empire depends upon this battle. Every man shall do his utmost. But almost immediately, the plan began unraveling in ways that revealed the fatal gap between Japanese intentions and American capabilities. On October 23rd, as Kurita's force traversed the Palawan Passage, 2 American submarines lay waiting. USS Data and USS Dace had been vectored into position by intelligence that decoded Japanese movement orders almost as quickly as Kurita received them. At 5:32 a.m., Data's torpedoes struck the heavy cruiser Atago, Kurita's flagship. Minutes later, Dace torpedoed the heavy cruiser Maya. Within an hour, both cruisers had sunk. Another heavy cruiser, Takao, was crippled and forced to retreat. Kurita, thrown into the water, was rescued and transferred to Yamato. He had lost 3 heavy cruisers and hadn't even made contact with American surface forces. The submarines that had ambushed him represented just 2 of over 50 American submarines now prowling Philippine waters. This underwater gauntlet, completely absent from Toyoda's planning, would claim more Japanese vessels before the battle ended. The disparity in reconnaissance became immediately apparent. American search planes from Task Force 38 located Kurita's force early on October 24th as it entered the Sibuyan Sea. Precise contact reports flowed to Halsey: 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, 15 destroyers, course 050, speed 20 knots. Meanwhile, Japanese search planes, those few that managed to launch, were shot down before sending reports. Kurita was sailing blind while the Americans tracked his every movement. At 10:26 a.m., the first American airstrike found Kurita's center force. 259 aircraft from Task Force 38's carriers, Essex, Lexington, Enterprise, and Franklin, descended on the Japanese fleet. Wave after wave followed throughout the day. Musashi, the super battleship that Toyoda considered invincible, became the focus of American attention. Torpedo planes approached from multiple angles while dive bombers screamed down from above. Musashi's executive officer, Commander Kato, recorded the mounting damage. First strike, 1 torpedo hit. Second strike, 3 torpedoes, 4 bombs. Third strike, 4 more torpedoes. Fourth strike, another 10 torpedo hits. The great ship's speed fell from 27 to 12 knots. She listed increasingly to port despite desperate counter-flooding. At 7:35 p.m., Musashi capsized and sank, taking over 1,000 men with her. The Americans lost 18 planes, destroying 1 battleship. They had hundreds more aircraft available. The calculus of war had become undeniable. But incredibly, Halsey concluded from pilot reports that Kurita's force had been so badly damaged it no longer posed a serious threat. When Kurita temporarily reversed course to escape the air attacks, Halsey assumed he was retreating permanently. Meanwhile, Ozawa's northern force had finally succeeded in its mission to be spotted. His 4 carriers, virtually empty of aircraft after the Formosa battle, sailed south from Japan advertising their presence. Ozawa actually transmitted in plain language, hoping to be detected. By afternoon of October 24th, American search planes had located him. Halsey's reaction was everything Toyoda had hoped for. At 8 p.m. on October 24th, Halsey made the decision that would become the most controversial of his career. He would take the entire Third Fleet north to destroy Ozawa's carriers. Task Force 34, the battle line of 6 modern battleships that was supposed to guard San Bernardino Strait, would go with him. Every ship, every aircraft, would pursue the Japanese carriers. San Bernardino Strait would be left completely unguarded. Halsey's reasoning seemed sound to him. He had been trying to destroy Japanese carriers for 3 years. Here they were, apparently offering battle. His pilots reported Kurita's force heavily damaged and retreating. The 7th Fleet's old battleships could handle any Japanese forces approaching from the south. But Halsey had taken Toyoda's bait completely. He was racing north after empty carriers, while Kurita's still powerful force was turning back towards San Bernardino Strait. At Surigao Strait, the southern arm of Toyoda's pincer movement met annihilation. Vice Admiral Jesse Oldendorf, commanding 7th Fleet's bombardment force, had deployed his ships in the perfect tactical position naval officers had dreamed of since the age of sail. He had crossed the T. As Nishimura's force advanced in column through the narrow strait, Oldendorf's battleships and cruisers waited in line across its northern exit. The battle was a massacre. American PT boats attacked first, followed by destroyer torpedo attacks. Then Oldendorf's battleships, 5 of them Pearl Harbor survivors hungry for revenge, opened fire with radar-directed guns. Yamashiro and Fuso were torn apart. In the darkness, American radar gave decisive advantage while Japanese optical rangefinders were useless. By dawn, Nishimura was dead and his force destroyed. Only 1 destroyer escaped. Admiral Shima, following behind with his independent force, arrived to find only burning wreckage and oil-covered survivors in the water. He immediately reversed course. The southern pincer of Toyoda's trap had been not merely defeated but obliterated. The last battleship versus battleship engagement in history had ended in total American victory. But at that moment of triumph, catastrophe loomed. Kurita had turned back towards San Bernardino Strait after dark on October 24th. Finding it incredibly unguarded, he passed through during the night. As dawn broke on October 25th, his force, still containing 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, and 11 destroyers, emerged off the island of Samar. Directly in his path lay only Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's Task Unit 77.4.3, known by its radio call sign as Taffy 3. Taffy 3 consisted of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The escort carriers were converted merchant ships, slow and unarmored. Their aircraft were armed for ground support, not naval combat. The destroyers and destroyer escorts were designed for anti-submarine warfare, not surface combat. Against them came Yamato with its 18-inch guns, 3 more battleships, and heavy cruisers with 8-inch batteries. At 6:45 a.m., lookouts on the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted pagoda masts on the horizon. Moments later, massive waterspouts erupted around the American ships as Japanese shells arrived. The first salvos contained colored dye to help Japanese gunners spot their fall, red, yellow, green, purple geysers erupting around the fleeing escort carriers. Sprague reacted with desperate innovation. He ordered his carriers to launch every aircraft regardless of armament. Fighters without bullets made dummy runs on Japanese ships. Torpedo planes without torpedoes dove empty at battleships to distract gunners. He sent his destroyers on suicidal torpedo runs against ships 10 times their size. He made smoke, dodged into rain squalls, and ran at maximum speed toward the only help available, Taffy 2 to the south. The destroyer Johnston exemplified the impossible courage of that morning. Commander Ernest Evans, knowing his ship faced certain destruction, charged the entire Japanese fleet. Johnston fired torpedoes at the heavy cruiser Kumano, blowing off her bow. Japanese shells tore Johnston apart piece by piece, but she continued fighting. When finally sunk after 3 hours of combat, Evans was last seen helping wounded sailors abandon ship. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, Raymond, and John C. Butler joined the attack. Roberts, known as the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, closed to point-blank range with the heavy cruiser Chokai, her 5-inch guns firing so rapidly the paint burned off the barrels. When torpedoes were gone, when guns were destroyed, the American escorts continued making smoke and drawing fire from the carriers. Meanwhile, Taffy 3's aircraft performed miracles of improvisation. Pilots dropped depth charges on destroyers, strafed bridge crews with machine guns, made dummy runs when ammunition was exhausted. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huddleston made 10 attacks in his Avenger torpedo bomber, returning repeatedly to his carrier for whatever ordnance was available, even small anti-personnel bombs. Ensign Hans Jensen dove his Wildcat fighter at a Japanese cruiser with no ammunition, pulling out at the last second repeatedly to distract its gunners. Incredibly, impossibly, the desperate American resistance began affecting Kurita's judgment. The aggressive attacks convinced him he faced a much stronger force than 6 escort carriers and their tiny escorts. The Americans were fighting like they had major forces available. Smoke screens obscured his targets. Rain squalls hid the fleeing carriers. His formation scattered as individual ships maneuvered to avoid torpedoes. Japanese communications, never reliable, completely broke down. Kurita couldn't coordinate his forces. Ships were firing at each other in the confusion. The heavy cruisers Chokai, Chikuma, and Suzuya were fatally damaged by the combined efforts of aircraft and destroyers. Yamato, maneuvering to avoid torpedo attacks, found herself sailing away from the battle, unable to bring her massive guns to bear effectively. At 9:25 a.m., just as Taffy 3 appeared doomed, with the escort carrier Gambia Bay sinking and others taking hits, something extraordinary happened. Kurita ordered his forces to break off action and regroup to the north. The stunned Americans watched as the Japanese fleet that had been minutes from annihilating them turned away. Signalmen on Fanshawe Bay shouted in disbelief, "They're getting away!" Kurita's decision remains one of the most debated in naval history. He had received reports of carriers to the north, possibly Halsey's fleet carriers. He feared massive air attacks were imminent. His forces were scattered and disorganized. He had already lost 3 cruisers with others damaged. Most crucially, he had no idea that Leyte Gulf, his ultimate objective, was essentially defenseless. The transports Toyoda had sent him to destroy had already unloaded and departed. After regrouping, Kurita made one more half-hearted attempt to reach Leyte Gulf, but at 12:36 p.m. he made his final decision. He ordered his forces to withdraw through San Bernardino Strait. The Imperial Navy's last offensive operation was over. His reasoning was pragmatic and humane. Sacrificing his remaining ships and crews for empty anchorage made no sense. Meanwhile, 300 miles to the north, Halsey's Third Fleet was annihilating Ozawa's decoy force. American carrier planes sank all 4 Japanese carriers in a completely one-sided battle. But even as his pilots celebrated their victory, Halsey received increasingly desperate messages from 7th Fleet. "Where is Task Force 34? "The world wonders," Nimitz signaled in frustration, the padding phrase accidentally left in the decoded message. Halsey finally turned south with his battleships, but it was far too late. By the time his forces arrived off San Bernardino Strait, Kurita had escaped. The fastest battleships in the world had spent the critical day of battle racing north, then racing south, and firing not a single shot at Japanese surface forces. As if the morning's near catastrophe wasn't enough, October 25th brought one more horror. At 10:47 a.m., a Zero fighter dove vertically into the escort carrier St. Lo. The plane's bomb penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar. Secondary explosions tore the ship apart. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo sank. She was the first major victim of organized kamikaze attacks, a new form of warfare born from Japanese desperation. More kamikazes followed throughout the day. They damaged several escort carriers and other vessels. The suicide attacks would continue for the rest of the war, but they couldn't change the strategic reality. Japan had begun the battle with 67 warships, 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers had been sunk. The Americans lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The human cost was equally disproportionate. Approximately 10,500 Japanese sailors died. American casualties totaled about 2,800. Among the dead was Rear Admiral Masafumi Arima, who had personally led one of the first kamikaze attacks, diving his plane into the carrier Franklin. His sacrifice, like the entire Sho-Go operation, achieved nothing strategically. Among the American dead were 113 sailors of St. Lo, killed in the first successful kamikaze attack, with approximately 30 more dying later from their wounds. The aftermath revealed the totality of Japanese miscalculation. Toyoda had believed the Formosa air battle was a great victory. It had been a catastrophic defeat. He had assumed American carrier strength was depleted. It had never been stronger. He had thought Japanese pilots could match American aviators. They were slaughtered in every encounter. He had believed the super battleships were invincible. Musashi lay at the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea. The intelligence failures were even more damaging. While American code breakers read Japanese messages almost in real time, Japanese intelligence was blind. They never detected the American submarine wolf packs that savaged their forces. They couldn't track American carrier movements accurately. They consistently overestimated damage inflicted while underestimating their own losses. Admiral Mitcher's action report was tersely factual. The enemy fleet has been decisively defeated and is in full retreat. Task Force 38 had launched 527 sorties against Ozawa's decoy force and 259 against Kurita's center force. His pilots had performed magnificently, but he privately criticized Halsey's decision to leave San Bernardino unguarded. It had nearly led to disaster. Kincaid's report was more pointed. The 7th Fleet's escort carriers had faced annihilation because 3rd Fleet abandoned its covering position. Only the incredible courage of Taffy III's sailors had prevented catastrophe. The lack of unified command between 7th and 3rd Fleets had nearly handed victory to an already defeated enemy. The Japanese survivors struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their defeat. Captain Toshikazu Omai, Ozawa's operations officer, later testified, "We were like midgets fighting giants. Everything was overwhelmingly against us. The number of ships, the number of aircraft, the efficiency of radar, the ability to maintain ships and aircraft, the supply system. We never had a chance." Commander Tonosuke Otani of Yamato was more specific. "The Americans fought with a coordination we could never achieve. Their carrier planes arrived in perfectly timed waves. Their submarines were positioned exactly where we had to pass. Their radar saw us long before we saw them. Their damage control saved ships we would have lost. They had become masters of naval warfare while we still fought like it was 1941. For Kurita, the burden of command decision haunted him forever. In post-war interviews, he maintained he made the correct choice withdrawing when he did. Sacrificing his fleet for empty ocean made no sense. But he also admitted to confusion and exhaustion during the battle. He had been in continuous action for 3 days, his flagship had been sunk under him, and he was receiving contradictory reports from all sides. The mysterious retreat from victory became a subject of endless debate in Japan. Why did Kurita turn away when Taffy 3 was within his grasp? Some blamed fatigue and shock from the submarine attack. Others suspected he never believed in Toyoda's plan and subconsciously sabotaged it. Still, others argued he showed humanitarian wisdom in not sacrificing thousands of sailors for a meaningless gesture. But the real answer was simpler. Kurita turned away because he was beaten. Not by the handful of escort carriers and destroyers immediately before him, but by the accumulated weight of American naval power. He knew that even if he destroyed Taffy 3, even if he reached Leyte Gulf, massive retaliation would follow. The Americans could lose ships and replace them. Japan could not. Toyoda's reaction to defeat was characteristic. He blamed everyone but himself. The pilots had given inaccurate reports. Kurita had failed to press his attack. Ozawa had been detected too late. Nishimura had advanced too rashly. But the fundamental failure was Toyoda's. He had crafted a plan based on wishful thinking rather than realistic assessment of enemy capabilities. In his post-war interrogation, Toyoda admitted, "We had to take the gamble. If we lost the Philippines, the fleet would be useless anyway without fuel from the south. But I underestimated American strength. I believed our spirit could overcome material disadvantage. I was wrong. The Americans had become better sailors than us. That was the bitter truth." The destruction at Leyte Gulf ended the Imperial Japanese Navy as an effective force. Without fuel, the surviving ships became immobile steel monuments to failed strategy. Yamato would make one more sortie, a suicide run to Okinawa in April 1945, where American carrier planes would send her to the bottom in less than 2 hours. The other survivors rusted at anchor until American bombs sank them in port. The battle's impact extended beyond mere ship losses. Japan lost irreplaceable trained sailors and officers. The naval aviation arm, already crippled, ceased to exist. The merchant marine, deprived of naval protection, was annihilated by American submarines. Japan was now cut off from resources in the south, accelerating economic collapse. For the Americans, Leyte Gulf validated 3 years of growth and learning. The Navy that had started the war with obsolete tactics and peacetime thinking had evolved into the most powerful naval force in history. Every aspect, from carrier operations to submarine warfare to amphibious assault to logistics, had reached peak efficiency. The industrial disparity that had always favored America became even more pronounced. While Japan scraped together fuel for final operations, American shipyards were launching new Essex-class carriers monthly. While Japanese pilots received minimal training, American aviation programs were producing thousands of highly qualified aviators. While Japanese technology stagnated, American innovation accelerated. Radar development exemplified the gap. American ships at Leyte Gulf employed sophisticated fire control radar that could track targets in complete darkness. Search radar could detect aircraft over 100 miles away. Navigation radar allowed precise movement through restricted waters. Japanese radar remained primitive when it existed at all. They fought a 20th-century electronic war with 19th-century optical instruments. Damage control revealed another crucial difference. American ships survived damage that would have sunk Japanese vessels. Carriers hit by kamikazes were operating again within hours. Destroyers with their bows blown off limped home for repairs. Sophisticated firefighting systems, redundant pumping stations, and trained damage control teams saved ships that seemed doomed. Japanese damage control remained fatalistic. When fires started, when flooding began, ships were often abandoned that might have been saved. Logistics proved equally decisive. The unglamorous fleet train sustained American operations across thousands of miles of ocean. Task Force 38 consumed 17,000 tons of fuel oil daily, refueling at sea from fleet oilers. Ammunition ships transferred shells while underway. Repair vessels fixed battle damage without returning to port. The Japanese had nothing comparable. Their ships had to return to base for everything, limiting operational flexibility catastrophically. The human dimension was equally decisive. American sailors were products of democratic society, encouraged to show initiative and innovation. When officers were killed, enlisted men took command. When equipment failed, they improvised solutions. When facing impossible odds, like Taffy 3, they fought with intelligent desperation that confused and defeated the enemy. Japanese sailors fought with equal courage, but within rigid hierarchical constraints. Initiative was discouraged. Innovation was suspect. When plans failed, when communication broke down, paralysis often resulted. The same social structure that had given Japan advantages in 1941 became a liability by 1944. Modern naval warfare required flexibility and adaptation that Japanese military culture couldn't provide. Perhaps most significantly, information flow differed completely. American after-action reports were brutally honest. Mistakes were analyzed, lessons learned, tactics modified. Bad officers were relieved, good ideas from junior officers were adopted. The feedback loop from combat to training was measured in weeks. Japanese reports were filtered through face-saving bureaucracy. Failures were minimized, successes exaggerated. The same mistakes repeated because no one admitted they were mistakes. The role of intelligence was decisive. American codebreakers provided strategic warning of Japanese intentions. Radio intercepts revealed tactical movements. Captured documents explained enemy capabilities. Coast watchers reported ship movements. Submarines provided visual reconnaissance. The Americans fought with near-perfect information while Japan operated in intelligence darkness. Training systems showed the accumulated advantage of 3 years' experience. American pilot training programs, expanded massively since Pearl Harbor, were producing aviators faster than they could be assigned to squadrons. Advanced training in Hawaii and California replicated combat conditions. Veterans rotated home to share hard-won knowledge. By contrast, Japanese training had collapsed. Fuel shortages limited flight hours. Experienced instructors were dead. New pilots arrived at squadrons barely able to land on carriers. The technological revolution in naval warfare accelerated under American leadership. Proximity fuses made anti-aircraft fire lethal. Improved torpedoes ran straight and exploded reliably. Problems that had plagued early war operations finally solved. Better aircraft engines provided superior performance. Advanced communications allowed precise coordination. Japan struggled to maintain existing technology, while America continuously innovated. October 28, 1944. Imperial Naval Headquarters, Tokyo. Admiral Toyoda read the final casualty reports with numb disbelief. The combined fleet that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had ranged victoriously from Hawaii to Ceylon had ceased to exist as an effective force. 4 carriers gone, 3 battleships sunk, 10 cruisers destroyed, thousands of irreplaceable sailors and aviators dead. The trap he had so carefully prepared had indeed been sprung, but it had caught the wrong fleet. The Americans had not followed his script. They had written their own, one where superior numbers, technology, and training inevitably defeated courage and spirit. The decisive battle he had sought had occurred, but the decision had gone overwhelmingly against Japan. "We believed we were setting a trap," Toyoda would later admit. "But we were like hunters who discover they are actually the prey. The Americans knew our every move while we stumbled blind. They had become the superior navy in every measurable way. We fought the war of 1941, while they fought the war of 1944. His staff sought explanations in specific failures. If only the pilots hadn't exaggerated at Formosa. If only Kurita had pressed forward at Samar. If only Ozawa had been spotted earlier. If only Nishimura had waited for Shima. But Toyoda knew these were symptoms, not causes. The fundamental failure was his refusal to accept reality. Japan could no longer compete with American naval power. The Sho-Go plan had been based on assumptions as flawed as those that had doomed Nazi Germany. The belief that spiritual strength could overcome material weakness. The conviction that warrior tradition was worth more than technological advancement. The assumption that democratic nations, being commercially minded, would lack military determination. Every assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. In Washington, Admiral King analyzed the victory with professional satisfaction, tempered by criticism of Halsey's northward dash. The battle had been won not because of brilliant American strategy, but despite serious command failures. The divided command between 3rd and 7th Fleets had nearly produced disaster. Only tactical superiority at every level had saved the situation. King's report to Roosevelt was succinct. The Japanese fleet has been effectively destroyed as a fighting force. They retain some individual ships but lack the fuel, aircraft, and trained personnel to conduct further offensive operations. The path to Japan itself is now open. The war's outcome is no longer in doubt, only its duration. Roosevelt understood the implications immediately. With the Japanese Navy eliminated, invasion of the Philippines could proceed unhindered. Submarines could close Japan's remaining supply routes without interference. Carrier task forces could range freely, striking targets at will. The strategic stranglehold would tighten inexorably until Japan surrendered or was invaded. For MacArthur, vindication was complete. His insistence on liberating the Philippines rather than bypassing them had been validated. The Japanese decision to fight the decisive battle at Leyte had delivered their fleet into his hands. His dramatic return had been more than theatre, it had been strategically decisive. The road to Tokyo now led through Manila, exactly as he had planned. But the greatest vindication belonged to the unnamed thousands who had transformed the US Navy from the shocked peacetime force of 1941 into the supreme naval power of 1944. The sailors who had learned damage control through desperate experience. The pilots who had developed fighter tactics through deadly trial and error. The submariners who had solved torpedo problems and decimated Japanese shipping. The intelligence officers who had cracked enemy codes, the logisticians who had created the mobile fleet train. Each had contributed to overwhelming victory. The Battle of Leyte Gulf stands as history's largest naval engagement, not just in ships and aircraft committed, but in strategic impact. Over 200,000 sailors had participated. The ocean area contested exceeded that of entire European countries. The 4 separate engagements, Sibuyan Sea, Surigao Strait, Cape Engaño, and Samar, each would have ranked among history's major naval battles independently. Yet for all its massive scale, the battle's outcome had hinged on individual decisions and actions. Ernest Evans charging the Japanese fleet in USS Johnston. Hans Jensen making dummy runs in his Wildcat fighter. Kurita turning away when victory seemed within grasp, Halsey taking the bait of empty carriers. Individual courage and individual mistakes had shaped the course of history. The technological revolution displayed at Leyte Gulf would define naval warfare thereafter. Carrier aviation had proven decisively superior to big gun battleships. Submarines had shown their ability to shape battles before they began. Radar had provided crucial advantage in every engagement. Electronic intelligence had given strategic warning. The age of network-centric warfare had begun, even if the term wouldn't be coined for decades. The human cost haunts memory. Approximately 10,500 Japanese sailors died, many trapped in sinking ships, others floating in oil-covered water waiting for rescue that never came. American losses, though far lighter, included acts of supreme sacrifice that deserve eternal remembrance. The 224 men of Johnston who died with their captain. The 113 sailors of St. Lo killed by the first successful kamikaze. The hundreds of aviators who didn't return from strikes. Each death was a universe destroyed, a family devastated. The psychological impact on survivors lasted lifetimes. American veterans of Taffy 3 suffered nightmares of 18-inch shells walking toward their defenseless ships. Japanese survivors carried the shame of defeat in a culture that didn't forgive failure. Kurita never escaped questions about his decision to withdraw. Halsey defended his northward run until death, but privately acknowledged doubt. In Japan, the battle's aftermath brought recognition of inevitable defeat, though few dared voice it. The navy that had been the shield of empire was broken. The fuel that powered industrial society was cut off. The merchant marine that fed the population was being systematically destroyed. Only the army's refusal to acknowledge reality prolonged agony. The kamikaze phenomenon, born from Leyte Gulf's desperation, would claim thousands more lives before war's end. Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who organized the first special attack units, committed suicide after surrender, leaving a note apologizing to the young pilots he had sent to death. The tactic that seemed to offer hope merely confirmed Japan had passed from conventional warfare to death cult. For America, Leyte Gulf confirmed that free societies, when threatened, could generate military power exceeding any dictatorship. The society that Japan's leaders had dismissed as weak and materialistic had proven stronger and more determined. The navy built by democratic workers had crushed the samurai fleet. Innovation from free minds had defeated rigid tradition. The arsenal of democracy had proven mightier than Bushido's sword. Admiral Spruance, who had missed Leyte Gulf while planning future operations, provided the most balanced assessment. The battle was won by cumulative superiority in every aspect of naval warfare. We had more ships, better aircraft, superior radar, better intelligence, better logistics, and by 1944, better trained personnel. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, but they were fighting the last war while we were fighting this one. The strategic consequences rippled globally. Germany, watching its last major Allies' navy destroyed, knew the war was lost. Stalin, observing American naval supremacy, began planning Soviet Pacific involvement. British forces, freed from Japanese naval threat, could concentrate on Burma and Malaya. The global balance had shifted decisively and permanently. Post-war analysis revealed the totality of American intelligence penetration. Not only were Japanese naval codes being read, but diplomatic messages, army communications, and even harbor master reports were intercepted and decoded. The Americans knew Japanese intentions often before Japanese commanders received their orders. It was as if one side played chess while seeing all opponents' pieces, while the other played blindfolded. The aftermath of Leyte Gulf accelerated Japan's collapse. Without naval protection, merchant shipping was annihilated. By early 1945, imports had fallen 90%. Industry ground to halt without raw materials. Food distribution collapsed without transport. Cities burned without firefighting equipment. The Navy's destruction at Leyte had triggered societal disintegration. American planning immediately exploited victory. Invasion of Luzon proceeded without naval opposition. B-29 bases were established within range of Japan. Submarine operations intensified to complete the blockade. Carrier raids struck targets previously unreachable. The noose tightened with mechanical efficiency. The final insult came in July 1945, when American battleships bombarded the Japanese coast with impunity. The nation that had begun war with the world's third-largest navy couldn't prevent enemy warships from standing offshore and shelling cities. The humiliation was complete. The divine winds had failed. The Emperor's navy had vanished. Only unconditional surrender remained. Toyoda survived the war to be interrogated by American intelligence officers. His answers revealed the depth of Japanese miscalculation. "We thought Americans were soft," he admitted. "We believed our spiritual superiority would overcome material disadvantage. We thought they would negotiate rather than fight to total victory. Every assumption was wrong. They were harder than us, more determined than us, and in the end, better sailors than us." When asked about Sho-Go's failure, Toyoda was philosophical. The plan was perfect if the enemy cooperated. But the enemy never cooperates. That is the first rule of war we forgot. We created an elaborate trap, then walked into it ourselves. The Americans didn't defeat our plan. Reality defeated it. We were fighting our imagination of American weakness rather than actual American strength. His interrogators noted Toyoda's intelligence and honesty, but also his inability to fully grasp the magnitude of miscalculation. He still spoke of Japanese spirit and American materialism as if these were comparable factors. He couldn't accept that American sailors had shown greater spirit at Samar than Japanese sailors, that American pilots had displayed more dedication, that free citizens had produced warriors superior to imperial subjects. The Sho-Go plan's failure was not just operational, but conceptual. It assumed war was about climactic battles rather than sustained attrition. It privileged warrior drama over logistics reality. It confused tactical complexity with strategic wisdom. It believed spiritual motivation could overcome training deficiencies and technological inferiority. Every assumption reflected wishful thinking rather than professional analysis. October 25, 1964. 20 years after the battle. Survivors from both sides met at a memorial service in the Philippines. Ernest Evans' widow met the captain of the Japanese destroyer that had helped sink Johnston. Veterans of Taffy 3 shook hands with survivors from Yamato. The reconciliation was genuine, but couldn't hide the battle's fundamental asymmetry. The Americans had come as representatives of a victorious navy still dominant globally. The Japanese came as individuals from a maritime force that existed only in memory. Admiral Kurita, still alive though aged and ill, sent a message to the reunion. "We fought with all our strength and lost to a stronger enemy. There is no shame in that defeat, only in not learning from it. The lesson is clear. Never begin a war you cannot win. Never assume spirit can overcome reality. Never believe your enemy is weaker because you wish him to be. These are the lessons written in blood at Leyte Gulf." But perhaps the last word should belong to an ordinary sailor, Seaman James Fahey of USS Montpellier, who wrote in his diary the night after the battle, "Today we destroyed the Japanese fleet." It seems strange to write those words. 3 years ago they seemed invincible. Now they're gone. All those ships, all those men. Gone. I'm glad we won, but I'm sad it had to happen. All those sailors were just like us, following orders, doing their duty. War is waste. Victory doesn't change that truth. The Battle of Leyte Gulf remains history's largest naval engagement, a superlative unlikely ever to be exceeded. Nuclear weapons and missile technology have made such massive fleet encounters obsolete. But the lessons endure. Superior technology, training, logistics, and intelligence will defeat courage and spirit. Industrial capacity and innovation matter more than warrior tradition. Open societies, when aroused, generate military power that closed systems cannot match. Toyoda had believed he was setting a trap for MacArthur's fleet. He had crafted an elaborate plan requiring perfect timing and enemy cooperation. He had counted on Japanese spirit overcoming American material superiority. Instead, he had led the Imperial Navy to virtual annihilation. The trap had closed, but on the wrong fleet. The decisive battle had occurred, but the decision had gone entirely to the Americans. From his confident assessment on October 17th that the Americans were sailing into his web to the shattered remnants limping back to Japan on October 28th, Toyoda's journey traced the arc of Japanese naval destruction. His contempt for American capabilities, his faith in spiritual superiority, his belief that complexity meant cleverness, all had proven catastrophically wrong. The architect of Sho-Go lived to see his nation occupied by the enemy he had dismissed as inferior. The numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. Japan entered the battle with 4 aircraft carriers, 9 battleships, 19 cruisers, and 34 destroyers. They lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The Americans entered with 34 aircraft carriers, 12 battleships, 24 cruisers, and 141 destroyers. They lost 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, and 3 destroyers. The disparity in losses was matched only by the disparity in forces engaged, but the real victory lay not in numbers, but in validation of approach. The American investment in training, technology, and logistics had proven correct. The Japanese gamble on spirit and sacrifice had failed. Democratic mobilization had proven superior to authoritarian command. Professional competence had defeated warrior mysticism. The arsenal of democracy had buried Bushido beneath overwhelming firepower. The sailors of Taffy III, facing annihilation on that desperate morning off Samar, had proven that Americans could match anyone in courage while maintaining technological and tactical superiority. Each destroyer making its doomed torpedo run, each pilot diving empty at battleships, each signalman staying at his post as shells walked toward his ship. They had shown that free citizens could fight with dedication exceeding samurai tradition. Toyoda had laughed at the idea of America's industrial democracy defeating Japan's warrior culture. America responded by sending the Imperial Navy to the bottom of the Pacific, transforming naval warfare in the process. His laughter echoed through history as the sound of fatal miscalculation. The dismissal of democracy's power by a man who understood neither democracy nor modern naval power. In the end, both buried him and everything he represented beneath the waters of Leyte Gulf, where the rusting wreckage of his fleet still lies as monument to the dangers of underestimating democratic resolve.